Welcome to the webinar from Technology Needs to Implementation, Closing the Finance Gap. My name is Leah. I'm working for the Technology Needs Assessment Project at UNEP DTU Partnership, and I will be the moderator of today's webinar. This webinar is hosted by UNEP DTU Partnership in relation to the Technology Needs Assessment Project and is organized in collaboration with the UNFCCC, Sunfunder, and the Private Financing Advisory Network. This webinar will highlight finance needs for climate technology implementation, explain the different steps of project development and proposal preparation, and give insights into different types of technology-inclusive projects. A couple of things before we move to the main content of our webinar. The session will last around 1 hour and 30 minutes, and it will include time for a Q&A session. You will be muted during the webinar, but please, you're more than welcome to write your questions through the chat box during the presentations that will be made by the speakers. Also, please do remember to indicate the name of the speaker that you're asking the question to. If you're not able to stay until the end of the session of today, or if you want to access our presentations again, no worries. A recording of the webinar will be available online in a few days on the TNA website, which you can see the link on the slide. So, regarding the agenda of today, we will start with Sara, who will introduce the TNA project. She will be followed by Vladimir, who will share UNFCCC perspectives on the finance needs reported by countries in the TNA process. Federico will present our newly published finance guide for the implementation of technology action plans. Peter will explain how to prepare good project proposal for technology inclusive projects. Sammy will share perspectives on innovative approaches to finance technology inclusive projects. Then comes the time for a Q&A session, where panelists will answer the questions you might have. Before we start, I would like to inform you that we comply with the GDPR. So it means that your personal data, such as name, email, and workplace, is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights in relation to GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that inaccurate data be deleted or rectified. So if you need further information on that, please feel free to contact Aris and Louise that you can see on this slide. Now, let me introduce the speakers of today's webinar. Sara Trærup. Sara joined UNEP DTU Partnership in 2005. She has supported developing countries in identifying their technology needs, and she helped build capacity for accessing finance for implementing these technologies. She is both the global project manager for the TNA project, and she is regional coordinator for the African region. Vladimir Hecl. He is program officer at the UNFCCC in Bonn, in Germany. In 2006, Vladimir joined the technology implementation team of the UNFCCC, working in technology negotiations, in technology needs assessments of non-Annex 1 parties, including both mitigation and adaptation technologies. Federico Antonio Canu has been working at UNEP DTU Partnership since 2011, after being stationed at the Belize Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. Federico is experienced in providing capacity building for NAMA development in developing countries. Amongst his latest engagements, he provided support to Sao Tome and Principe in designing their NDC, and he also assisted Mozambique in developing capacities to adhere to the transparency requirements of the Paris Agreement. Peter Storey is a global coordinator of the Private Financing Advisory Network. This network is a multilateral public-private partnership which connects clean energy projects with investment in developing countries. Peter has significant experience in renewable energy as well as in other infrastructure sectors. He has held senior positions with major European banks and project developers. And over the last 20 years of experience he's been working on advising countries on how to structure their project. Sammy Malaki is the head of finance at Sunfunder. Sammy capitalizes on his experience to provide funding solutions to companies active in the solar sectors across Africa and Southeast Asia. He's an experienced professional with a demonstrated history of working in finance, tax, and provision of debt solutions in multi-currency environments. So, thank you for listening to this introduction. I will now give the floor to Sara, who will introduce the TNA project.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, where you are. To start off this webinar, I would very much like to give you first an introduction to what we speak about when we talk about technology needs assessments, because this is our starting point for the topic of the webinar today. How can we support countries in implementing their climate technology priorities for both mitigation and adaptation? And the technology needs assessments are exactly supporting countries in identifying and analyzing mitigation and adaptation technology priorities of the developing countries. It is a project funded by the Jehl, and it has run since 2009, supporting close to this year. We are reaching almost 100 developing countries that have participated in the project. So the technology needs assessments are a country-driven process implemented by national teams. This means that UNEP DTU Partnership supports a country-driven process with a national TNA coordinator, with a national team of consultants and expert working groups. So it's very much driven by stakeholder engagement at the national and local level. It is very much a process that builds up the in-country capacity. And it also has the national development objectives as a point of departure. And these days, of course, not least, the technology needs assessments focus very much on supporting countries in preparing implementation plans for how to reach their targets set under the nationally determined contributions. And thanks to the information that the TNAs provide about the potential, the ability and scale of the technologies, they can play a unique role in both the formulation of the updated NDCs and in the implementation of actions to reach the targets. So just to give you a brief overview of the steps of a so-called TNA process, and you will hear more about this later in the seminar, and why we are speaking about financing. Because as a first step, we speak about identification and prioritization of key sectors and technologies. It is done through identifying a set of criteria that is relevant to the national context and is in line with what the country would like to achieve with their technology needs assessment. As a second step, countries identify what are the challenges and the enabling frameworks required for transfer, diffusion, and uptake of the priority technologies. And then as a third step, we have what we call the technology action plans, which are ultimately a set of actions that support creating the enabling frameworks for the technology transfer, diffusion, and uptake. And what we should have here also as a fourth step is actually how do we come from these plans to implementation. And this is essentially what we will focus on today during this webinar. How do we take these technology action plans forward towards implementation? How do we close this financing gap between the plans and the real action on the ground? For these three steps, we have in the TNA process capacity building for each essential step. So we have 3 capacity building workshops, 1 for each of the steps. We have them at a regional level, inviting countries from the same region to join the workshop. Then we work with regional centers of excellence across Latin America, Caribbean, Africa, and Asia Pacific. We have a number of support missions to countries, and we have a whole thorough outlined methodology, guidebooks, etc., which are all available on the TNA website. And just to show you the range of countries that are or have been part of the global TNA process, this gives you an idea. The lighter blue ones are those that are currently conducting their TNAs. The darker ones have completed it. And then we have additional 17 small islands and least developed countries who are joining the project this year. And just to give you some ideas of what, okay, some countries have, or many countries during the last years have actually been successful in implementing their technologies from their TNAs. But of course, we would very much like to see much more of that. And this is one of the reasons we are having the webinar today, and that we have developed a new finance guidebook that my colleague Federico will present. So this is an example from Mongolia, what they used their TNA for, a number of things, but including accessing resources from the Green Climate Fund. They have actually been successful in 3 different proposals where they utilize the information generated from their technology needs assessments. We also have an example from Eswatini, where they completed their TNA or technology needs assessment in 2018. They integrated it in a project which is called the Ecolum-Bumble Biosphere Project. They integrated their priorities into that. They have also accessed funding from the Green Climate Fund, also from the Readiness Program to implement some of their technologies. And they have included it in proposals to the Africa Climate Fund and also integrated it into their national determined contribution. Then as a last example, I'll give you the one from Tunisia, which is an example of how a country have integrated their technology priorities and actions to create the enabling frameworks in the government policies. So this is an example of countries and governments taking action on their own, creating the frameworks that can actually make the technologies work within their country. And in this case, it was the government introducing a national program in support of hybrid cars, both in terms of regulatory and legal frameworks, but also they built capacity of relevant national stakeholders. And finally, we have all these technology needs assessments and technology action plans, but what we hear when we are working with countries and what countries are reporting in their technology action plans is that what we see is economic and financial challenges are by far the most frequently reported barrier or challenge, if you like, across all technologies. It is the high upfront cost of technologies, its difficulties in obtaining loans, the uncertainties regarding returns on investments, and a general lack of financial resources. And basically, we identify, based on the feedback from countries, that there is this great need for education and training, assisting countries in making the early stage decisions on financing, on matching country technology priorities with the funding sources. And this is exactly also what we would like to discuss here today. So how do we reach and bridge the gap between the needs identified and the finance that we actually know are available and is out there? So how do we close this gap? If you would like more information on the technology needs assessments, we have a website, and you can also explore the reports submitted by countries and their priorities and a lot more information. So please go to the websites as listed here. And I'm also always very happy to answer any questions you may have on this. By this, I would like to end my presentation and hand over to Vladimir Hecl from the UNFCCC Secretariat to speak more about the lessons learned from the work they do in the technology team in the UNFCCC. Vladimir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sara. Let me directly build on what Sara said, that on the one side, we have this high recognition of technology needs assessment in the Paris Agreement, calling to strengthen technical assistance and financial support. And on the other hand side, we're meeting numerous countries, or if you want, parties to convention, which ask us how to step up from technology action plans to realization of these good ideas. To picture the quantity, we have since 2009 until 2017 more than 50, but 53 technology needs assessment report on the table. And parties took very seriously the part of the report on technology action plans, as they worked out more than 600 technology action plans, including all the basic important elements such as responsible authority, such as budget and sub-budgets for project, what they want, time periods. So we have a first go enhanced since, let's say, first decade of DNA process to that direction. However, we are learning, still we are in a learning curve on how to merge or how to connect these good country stakeholders with all possible available money out there. And we also work on a couple of levels. We work on policy level, having technology mechanisms supporting Paris Agreement and the Technology Executive Committee, which I show you a couple of recommendations and how they were reached. And also we work actively with stakeholders and also private organizations being observers to the, and these are active observers to the work of tech. So let's first start at the synthesis report, which we synthesized quite recently. That's the work what Secretariat did, looking at the DNAs and synthesize them, coming also through some interesting barriers and enablers. And let me show you some in my presentation here. So these are barriers and enablers to technology transfer. So all, I mean, all is more than, we synthesize here 53 DNA countries, and they look very seriously at economic and financial barriers. They consider it main barrier to the development and transfer and prioritized technology. But of course, this is just a sort of a big picture, but each of them, and I will see some examples later, have a different angle how to approach this barrier, a different feeling. What does this mean for each country? Then we have some 92% of DNA country which identified lack or inadequate access to financial resources as the main barrier. We are working with developing countries, including least developed countries and small island states. Now, if we look at mitigation, the enablers which they thought to overcome barriers is a provision or expansion of financial incentive for implementation and use of the prioritized technology, and also formulation or updating of regulations, policies, and standards. I have it there also in relation to finance, since this is also a very important barrier for the environment to allow a different financial actors to operate in those markets. Now, in mitigation, I provide here some examples. We have been distilling in the report of what do we mean with these enablers. For example, we have 3 countries here from 3 regions. Belize came with reducing capital costs by reviewing tax schemes, raising awareness of available financial support, and passing regulation on tariffs and market scheme. Kazakhstan look at the tariff regulation to be improved to support investors in generally and improve the professional capacity of research and development institutions. Look also at the technical guidelines and standards in Togo, raising awareness among investors and project implementation, training to train community and local actors to enhance their capacity. So far, to give you some feeling from mitigation work in terms of what is demanded. Then if we look at adaptation, by the way, I also give you some share from these more than 600 technology action plans. We had quite equal distribution between mitigation and adaptation. There were about 47% of mitigation technology action plans and 53% of adaptation action plans. So we're looking here at adaptation. We look again, countries identify as the key barrier, economic and financial barrier, followed by policy, legal and regulatory, institutional and organizational capacity and human skills. Within the economic and financial category, majority of parties or countries identify lack or poor access to financial resources there as the main barrier. Now, enablers is again considered to increase financial resources available and accessible for a given technology, and strengthening capacity of relevant institution in order to accelerate research and development. Here, this is also quite challenging because to our knowledge, more focus still goes to mitigation actions for common reasons, and then to adaptation, more orientation of donors and investors of mitigation. Adaptation is a little bit, let's say, less explored field, as we also learn from countries. Now, take a look at some enablers in adaptation. They start with, we have example again from 3 regions. Burundi want to promote the use of low-cost available equipment, supporting local suppliers by granting tax exemptions, improving capacity of procurement units. Honduras look at introducing a budget line for implementation and technology and fund management, looking at capacity building and scientific studies for specific decision-making processes. In Jordan, we see tax regulation to promote private sector investment, implementing pilot projects, again looking at research in this case for agriculture. By the way, agriculture is the dominant sector in adaptation in the technology needs, and energy sector is dominant sector in mitigation. And the last but not least, significantly improving agricultural extension services. Now, if we look at the estimated finance needs for technology action plans, this is a big picture. However, it tells, you know, we had a little bit more numbers of adaptation projects. So you see the budget goes more to mitigation activities, then slightly followed by adaptation in Africa. The gap is bigger in Asia Pacific towards mitigation, and in Latin America we have a little bit smaller budget, but talking strongly for adaptation projects. Then you see also a number of technology action plans here, which we look at to give you this example. Now, another, let's say, stream to inform you on what's going on is the policy brief, which are regularly produced by Technology Executive Committee for consideration of parties, and as an input through a report. Also, we provide through reports, this is called the annual report of TechNCTCN. We provide also key messages on TNA regularly, and this is also coming from work with stakeholders, from interviews with stakeholders, discussion with countries on specific issues which they wish to highlight. And here we come again. The feedback was focusing on access to financial resources as the main identified barrier, further promotion of implementation plans and activities to stimulate interest of financial institutions, and also the need for combination of market stimulation and human capacity development in countries. We have a couple of more, again, focusing on quite similar areas we've seen in the TNAs, and this is strengthening the institutional research and scientific capacity of developing countries. So in order to also develop their own technologies, and then actively involving donors and financial experts TNA process, which we also try to do now, but this webinar, and again, discuss the issue because we find it as one of the key issues to deal is to close or assist to close implementation gaps in terms of climate technologies. And then the last and not least, further promote actual TNA results and success stories. Many countries are regularly turning to us to do this promotion. We try to help them out through our networks of partners, through our webpage, which is quite frequently visited, especially. And I finalize here by inviting you to see UNFCCC.org and then to go for the TT Clear portal and look at the TNAs, what we have, what projects we can offer. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be, of course, available for your questions or comments. And again, thank for also all the both financial participants to join us today. I'll be listening carefully for their inputs and for their assistance.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. Very interesting presentation indeed, and also a great introduction for my slides, which will be introducing the new finance guide for implementation of the technology action plans, which is now available for download on the TNA website. Well, my presentation is actually more of a presentation about the guidebook rather than about how to structure and attract finance for the implementation of actions that have been prioritized through TAPS. I leave it up to Peter and Sammy here to provide the good examples and talk more in depth about this specific topic. And you can always go to the publication and download it and read it and see the examples that we provide there. But I will start here by giving a bit of background, even though Sara and Vladimir already have done a great job at setting the scene for the topic. Then I will briefly introduce the scope of the guidebook, what kind of guidance we wanted to provide and why. And then very briefly about the structure of the guidebook, which I then will follow up by a summary of the guidebook's content chapter by chapter. Basically, according to the IPCC, we need a major reallocation of the global investment portfolio to make the finance flows consistent with the achievement of the Paris Agreement's goals and targets. And we can see that even though climate finance flows have been increasingly steadily in the recent years, and I think the most recent numbers have seen that we're about 600 billion annually, we're still far away from what the estimated needs are, which are between 3 and 5 trillion USD per year, needed to stay in line with the Paris targets of 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, respectively. As well as, we also have some estimated adaptation costs of 1.8 trillion USD per year. So this is way beyond the current climate finance provided, and there is therefore a need to scale up climate finance, but also to utilize the limited public resources available to use them strategically to catalyze and leverage finance from private sources. So going over to TNAs, conducting TNAs and implementing TAPS, the technology action plans, have become instrumental for developing countries in the process of identifying and prioritizing nationally appropriate climate actions. But as already noted by Sara and Vladimir, the lack of financing is identified as the most critical barrier to enhance climate action. And this is despite the fact that there is unspent finance available in international climate funds. So we have a contradiction. And so this contradiction and lack of finance from the intended recipients and available finance for the intended providers is partially due to a gap in understanding what is necessary to access finance and how to structure finance for climate intervention. And it was therefore evident for us that there is still a need to enhance capacity building efforts to turn TNAs and TAP results into financially sustainable climate investments and translate these investments into project proposals to acquire funding. So based on these arguments and the identified needs for enhanced capacity building on finance, the guidebook, basically its scope is to guide TNA practitioners and others interested parties on how to develop a business case for climate change mitigation and adaptation technology inclusive interventions, and to present this information in a structured proposal to donors and financiers. So the guidebook is divided in the following 6 chapters, which is one on the introduction to TNA process and financing of TAPs, one on the phases of proposal development, then a chapter on preparing a business case and financial plan for a climate intervention or project, then the application of financial instruments, concessionality, and incremental costs as concepts. Then we have a chapter on the building blocks of a proposal and how to prepare the first draft proposal. And then a final chapter on where we provide information that can be useful to select the appropriate financial partners for a specific targeted proposal based on the project that is developed. So chapter 1, as mentioned, it provides an introduction to the TNA process, which Sara already introduced, and also the financing required to implement TAPs, which is what Vladimir actually talked about. And here you can see some of the figures that feature in the guidebook. Basically, some of the information that Vladimir already mentioned here, presented in a more visual way. And the 3 phases already mentioned by Sara: the identification and prioritization, barrier analysis and enabling frameworks, and then the development of technology action plans resulting in project ideas. And this is where the guidebook takes over, basically, and tries to provide guidance in how to develop these ideas and concept notes into more structured, financeable, and bankable proposal. Chapter 2, it provides an overview of the different phases of proposal development. So a gradual process where the concept is elaborated and its finance structure developed and refined into a sustainable or bankable investment. It also provides a description of the financial aspects to be considered in the different phases and the central tasks involved in producing a document ready for submission. Here, with a specific focus on the financing aspects of project and proposal development. Of course, there are a lot of different topics that you can focus on when you describe what needs to go in a proposal. We don't go into details about ex ante greenhouse gas emission reduction calculations or other topics. We focus on the financing aspects here in this guidebook. Chapter 3, it explains the basic principles of accounting, basically used to structure, analyze, and present a business case. And it also describes the use of central financial indicators such as IRR, internal rate of return, net present value, debt service coverage ratio, etc. So this chapter is aimed at providing the central tools for understanding and communicating the expected financial performance of a given project. And it basically gives the tools to analyze and predict how the project will perform under different scenarios. And this helps project developers in illustrating the attractiveness and also potential risks and robustness of the intervention or action. So here illustrated in these tables from a fictive case that we use in the guidebook. And this analysis that we also provide it also describes how to determine whether a project is in need of financial support, so concessional finance, if it's needed for the project to materialize. So it also assists and guides the reader in identifying relevant financial instruments for implementation. We also present some real-life cases from tap actions which have managed to evolve and achieve financing for implementation as well. Chapter 4, it basically starts by introducing general global trends in climate finance, like investment sizes for different technologies and sectors, and which financial instruments are mainly used for different kinds of investments. So setting the scene and basically providing a context under which basically explaining the expectations for different kinds of technologies and different kinds of interventions and expectations of both potential financiers on the avenue to finance these kinds of actions. It also provides a description of central financial instruments. So we're talking about, equity, loans, grants, guarantees, etc. Their associated risks and who the usual providers of these instruments are. In this chapter, we also provide practical real-life examples on how these financial instruments are applied and how they're also blended into successful financial mechanisms, some more straightforward examples, and also some innovative examples, one including blockchain technology for agriculture and insurance, for instance. And finally, the chapter also describes two central financial principles, concessionality and incremental costs, which are central and both very relevant when you construct the arguments that explain to potential donors why the requested financial support is needed. So chapter 5, it provides information on the common building blocks, I would say, of a funding proposal and the information that is likely to be needed to respond to climate finance providers' requirements. And of course, we know that there is no one-fit-all formula, but here in the guidebook, we describe them as the project design and implementation plan, description of implementation partners, stakeholder engagement, how it's done, and how a stakeholder included and engaged in the project. Description of the technical assistance and capacity building needs, description of the budget and use of funds, impact potential and expected results, and also monitoring progress and impact indicators. We believe these are the central aspects. We also provide information on how different climate funds operate and how they interpret the information required. So we also give links and provide examples from, for instance, the GCF on how they interpret impact potential, what information they expect, and also some additional topics on, for instance, paradigm shifts or transformational change. So chapter 6, or the last chapter, present information on different sources of climate finance, their respective priorities, focus areas, and financial instruments they offer. And also, they also provide the general aspects of their operational modalities as well. So here we have more than these illustrated in the top, in the bottom right figure, but these are the central climate funds that we describe. And the chapter also guides project proponents in identifying appropriate climate finance providers other than climate funds. So also looking at bilateral assistance and some of the aspect of the private sector, so banking. What are the means of access, and basically some information that they can use to structure a proposal targeted for the appropriate financier and their specific services and priorities. And that was all on the new finance guidebook. Thank you for your attention. I hope you find the guidebook interesting and useful. As mentioned, it can be downloaded from the TNA website. You have the link here. And now we'll give the floor to Peter, which will go more into detail with the topic of preparing good projects and good project proposals.
Thank you, Federico. And thank you to the organizers, UNEP DTU and UNFCCC, for inviting me back into this process. I can remember being involved with the financing gap and TNA process from long ago. And it's really nice to see how the process is evolving and how much progress has been made since I was last involved in this. What I'd like to do today is to sort of move on from the basis that we've seen and heard from Federico. And it's really nice, Federico. I think everything that you've seen and you've put in the guidebook, I can relate to from my own practical experience of working with projects and evaluating them and raising finance for them. So it looks like to be a very practical, pragmatic and useful resource and something that should help this process. But I'd like to give a brief introduction to PFAN and what we do and how we work. But most of the presentation will be really focused on some lessons learned from our experience. And as Federico says, to sort of provide some guidance on what are really the key aspects, the key things to focus on when putting proposals together and starting the process of looking for finance. And that's really where PFAN's expertise lies. PFAN is a project preparation program hosted now by UNIDO and REAP, the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership. And we provide a project preparation facility and service, also helping projects and companies to facilitate investment, actually raise the money that they need to be able to implement and operate projects in the clean energy and climate space. Our goal is really to work towards the Paris Agreement and achieve the SDGs. We've been in existence for just over 10 years now, and there's some figures on the screen that you can see. I won't talk to them to indicate what we've achieved over that time. Essentially, we've helped a number of projects raise about, well, it's getting on towards $2 billion of investment in the meantime, and are working on something like 400 projects in the meantime. And all that really just to say that we know something about project preparation and the investment facilitation process. Because obviously, having seen that number of projects, we sort of understand what people are going through. The good news, I think, is that we've heard that access to finance is an issue, but the actual financial resources, certainly in our experience, are there. There's certainly unfamiliarity within the financial world with climate and clean energy projects, but the resources are there. And I think even more so now that such levels of climate finance are coming through into the market as well. And we have two sources that we can look at, both climate finance and private finance, and increasingly a blending of the two, as we're hearing from various new instruments that are being put into place. The problem is, and both Vladimir and Federico touched on this, is that on the supply side, we have a weakness in being able to put projects together, to structure them in such a way that they are meaningful, accessible to the people that have the money on the other side. And this is why the project proposal or the investment proposal is so important, because it essentially is the bridge between the demand side, the projects that require the money, and the investment side, those that have the money on the other side. And this is the gap that indeed PFAN tries to help with. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but this is just to give you a broad overview of the sort of projects that PFAN works with, and the things that we look for projects to be eligible for coming into our process. These are relatively straightforward, and I'll talk a little bit more in more detail about all of these aspects in the subsequent slides when we consider exactly what is necessary to make good proposals. So what are the key things that we look for in a project proposal? And I should perhaps emphasize that I'm looking at this very much now from a commercial financing perspective. But I think, as indicated, that many of these issues, many of these features and characteristics are equally applicable also to public sector and climate finance itself. So I think the first thing that we're looking for is a really strong value proposition. What do I mean by that? We need to understand that there is a real demand for the project, for the product or service that the project is offering or the company is offering. And not only that, but there is a long-term sustainability incentive built into the way that that product or service is delivered. And that a person, a company, or a group of companies and individuals have real ownership over that sort of delivery mechanism, and they are deriving benefit for themselves and also for the other stakeholders, their customers, and the environment in which they're operating. And without those, really, from a commercial perspective, we often find that it's very difficult then to really justify and go through the project development and financing process. The next thing that we're looking for is a robust business model. What do we mean by that? And broadly speaking, I'm generalizing, but the sort of projects that we tend to look at fall into two main categories. Either what I call infrastructure projects, where we have a generation technology being deployed to generate power, electricity of some sort, and feed into the grid. These models are what we call B2B or business to business, one business delivering electricity to a utility type off-taker, for instance. On the other hand, we have a variety of distribution and utility or service type models. For instance, solar home systems or cook stoves distributors who are delivering and distributing a product or service to a very wide range of customers. And these two broad models are extremely different, and they require different approaches, both in the way that the projects are put together and also in the way that they're evaluated and in the way in which they're presented to potential investors and financiers. Regardless of that, both of them require to have really strong revenue models, and we need to be able to understand where the revenues are coming from, how those revenues are being generated, and what are the inputs that are being fed into the mechanism to deliver and generate those sales. Very important is how do we actually collect the funds? Obvious but often missed. It's all very well being able to invoice for a product or service, but are you actually going to get paid? And do you have the ability to collect that payment? And again, particularly on the B2C models, we've seen tremendous advances in the last 5, 7, 10 years through the advent of mobile money, for instance, in collection ability for small amounts of invoiceables or receivables, and enabling through that much more innovative business models than we've seen prior to that in terms of addressing rural electrification, bottom of the pyramid, rural electrification type markets. One of the big features of the business model is being able to really understand the dynamics of the cost structure and the potential impacts on that cost structure and how market changes might affect it, and being able to react to that in such a way that if your prices, your input costs rise, you can also raise your output or sales costs, your sales prices, to keep the gross margin and at the end of the day, the net profit margins at the same level, and protect your ability to be able to service debt or provide a return to your investor. Another key aspect that we look at is how realistic is the plan itself. Again, it seems obvious, but these are the sort of the basics that we need to really deal with in terms of being able to verify the assumptions that are made in the plan and the proposal. And what we're looking here for is not so much a finger in the wind, but really those proposals that have gone out to do groundwork and understood and verified what their input costs are, what their logistics costs are, how much it costs to source a piece of equipment and operate it for a particular number of hours a day and produce the output that they're producing, and sell the electricity or sell the biogas that they're hoping to generate and produce. So what we're looking for in essence here is a degree of certainty in the forecasts and projections that are being made. One key aspect is the execution capability, which boils down to the track record and experience, perhaps, of the management team or the development team. Are they able to actually deliver on the plan that they've put together? Do they have processes in place to be able to standardize the procedures that they need to operate for the delivery of their service or product? And importantly, do they have skin in the game? Have they put their own money at stake? Or are they expecting the investor or the financier to take all of the risk? And it's not so much a question that 100% financing proposal or proposition is not tenable, but it perhaps changes who you're looking to and who you're asking for investment, and certainly changes the returns that you will be expected to be able to produce to justify the risk involved in taking that investment on. I think Federico mentioned this. It's clear risk analysis and mitigation is key to this process. Understanding what could go wrong, when it could go wrong, how badly it could go wrong, and if it does go wrong, what effect it has on my plan, on my costs, or my sales and revenues. And then understanding which risks are the most either likely to happen or which ones are the most likely to actually put me out of business, then testing the thresholds of those risks and understanding how long can I endure a 20% reduction in my sales before I go out of business. How long can I tolerate 20% less water flow through my hydro turbine before I start not being able to service my debt? And those sort of calculations and projections are vitally important for being able to understand whether the management team can deliver the plan, even in worst case or downside scenarios. We're also looking for a really strong and robust capital structure. What do we mean by this? The relationship essentially between the amount of equity that's in the business and the amount of debt that you can raise to leverage that equity, and what the valuation is of any equity proposal that you might be making. People often ask me, what is the ideal debt equity ratio? And the answer to that is there is no such thing, or how long is a piece of string, because each particular proposal, each particular project will have its own ideal. And part of the project preparation and development process is exactly to understand how much debt can the project sustain while maximizing the returns on equity, but still giving the debt providers enough security that they need to be able to feel comfortable that even in a worst case or a downside scenario, their debt or the debt will be repaid and at the interest rate that has been agreed. Commensurate risk on risk, commensurate return on risk. Again, there is no right answer to what is the right returns, and each investor group, each financier, each debt provider will have their own requirements. And this is why I think Federico was talking about it. It's so important to really understand what sort of investor or financier you might be talking to, and what sort of ideal investor your project can serve, because each will have their own requirements. And it is really not useful to take an impact type project to a venture capitalist, because an impact project might be returning, let's say, somewhere between 3 to 6% on capital, whereas a venture capitalist is looking for 30% a return on capital and probably even more than that. So part of the development process is really understanding what the returns of your project are, and based on that return profile, targeting the investors accordingly, and then talking to the right investors to optimize your own time and optimize their own time and resources. Very briefly, sort of extrapolated from all of that, some of the things and lessons that we've learned from looking at the number of proposals and projects that we've looked at over the years, and the sort of the gaps and mistakes that we've seen in proposals. And you can correlate them to the key areas that I've outlined, perhaps. Firstly, and it's surprising how often this happens, but the proposal doesn't actually have an ask. We don't know how much money is being requested, for what exactly it's being used, and whether it's being asked for in debt or equity. And without those pieces of information, any financing proposal that you put forward or any request for financing becomes, frankly, non-meaningful. I think there's a lot of unrealistic expectations of project developers when they start the financing process. Unrealistic in terms of not understanding where they are in the development process. And often we find at PFAN that projects think they're further advanced than they are, and they actually require a lot more time and effort before they're really ready to be able to talk to investors and financiers and have the investment discussion. Connected with that, unrealistic expectations around the capital structure, and project developers coming to the table with a very good idea, a proposal which seems to be very high returning, but for a proposal where they're looking for 100% financing, i.e. they're not able to put any or much of their own money on the table, but still being or expecting to be able to walk away with a majority of that particular project. And that's unrealistic. If the investor is taking the majority of the risk on the equity side, the investor is going to expect the majority of ownership in the upside of the returns on that project or company or business in the future. We've talked quite a bit already, or I talked quite a bit already about the financial model, so I won't dwell on that too much more. But again, I think an inability to express the project ideas through the financial model is often seen, and I can really recommend that anybody that is presenting a proposal really does spend time developing a strong, robust model that reflects the project adequately, and especially one where the numbers and values through the written proposal or the business plan or the information memorandum are consistent with those that are actually used in the financial model and correlate in a way that is clearly visible for anybody looking at the documents. We often find that proposals, business plans are written as marketing documents, and this is a big, big mistake in the sense that an investor is never going to buy a biogas plant or a solar home system. They are providing funding for you to be able to build and operate a biogas plant or sell and distribute solar home systems or whatever other product or service that you're distributing. And when you write a business proposal or plan, you need to put yourself in the position of the investor or financier, and he wants to know the things, well, I think he wants to know the things that we've identified in the earlier slides in terms of you being able to repay his funding and provide a return on his capital. I will stop there and hand over to Sammy, who's probably going to talk about some of these things in much more detail from a particular funding perspective. Just to point out for anybody who's interested that in the annexes of the presentation that I think will be made available to you after the webinar, there's some more information on PFAN and also some case studies of projects that we've helped raise finance for in the past. Thank you very much and look forward to a discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Peter. My name is Sammy Malaki. I'm the head of finance at Sunfunder. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. The Sunfunder is a provider of debt to solar companies and projects working in emerging markets, and in particular in Africa. We have also been working with solar distributors who are setting up and are in need of finance to scale their businesses locally. Our mission has and always will be to pioneer this and scale solar finance, and it has enabled us to unlock over $150 million in debt through our funds. We have worked with over 50 companies in the paygo solar space, small industries looking to set up, solar backup power units and auxiliary units, as well as project managers to reach over 7 million people who would otherwise rely on fossil fuels for their source of energy. Just to touch, I'd quickly like to touch on our team. We are locally based. We're a small team, locally based and very nimble. And this has allowed us to be very innovative with our funding approaches so as to meet our borrowers' needs. We have extensive experience in the respective markets, as well as in funding for businesses. So, I mean, in terms of the ways in which we are innovating finance and the main reason is through a blended finance approach. The main way we have been able to innovate financing in the solar space is through structuring of our debts. Upon founding of Sunfunder, the approach was to raise funding through crowdfunding. This at the time was a great approach, but wasn't easily scalable. And for this reason, we shifted our focus from fundraising through crowdfunding sites to fundraising from high net worth individuals and family offices, and finally targeting DFIs. This approach of using capital money to de-risk public funding helped us unlock the market for blended finance and led to more players in the sector. So our first fund was the first fund that was dedicated, and this lessons that we got in the space were enabled other players to come on board, and this has increased the presence of commercial money in the sector. We are also proud that our capital deployment speeds are quite high, and this has allowed us to deploy funds quite rapidly. We are able to deploy funds to our borrowers as soon as the approval is made. So this is something that we pride in. In terms of so that's the back end. In terms of the front end, we work closely with our borrowers, and we work to tailor the funding approaches that we use with them. You know, it's not just a one fit all. We've been able to provide working capital, inventory finance, project finance, and financing through structured instruments such as SPVs. And this has helped us tailor-make products that will be able to meet the need of our borrowers, and also we have been able to work faster than local banks. Another thing that we pride on, and we see it as a key innovation, is our agility. We've been able to offer flexible and subordinate debt finances and smaller amounts. And this has seen us, work with partners such as PEG Africa from the first facility of $500,000 and to larger facilities of up to 15 million that involve syndication. So we've been able to work with them hand in hand, and this de-risks the whole process. Lastly, having protection mechanisms such as guarantees and political risk insurance has enabled us to expand to countries that many players would not want to expand to. For example, Central African Republic, where we closed our $5 million transaction. And this transaction was only made possible through the guarantees and political risk insurance that we took for this facility. And in addition, because of those two components, we're able to offer single digits in terms of interest rate to this particular borrower. And just to touch on a couple of projects that we have worked on, this is Daystar, just to showcase them. This is Daystar in Nigeria, where we're able to provide $4 million in an SPV. And as you know, this is for commercial purposes, showing how we've scaled our business from just the pay-go business, and now we are scaling to productive use. With Delight, who we've originally worked with since inception to provide pay-go, and we've been able to lend up to 15 million since inception. Cray being the transaction in Central African Republic, so as to provide ESCOs with funding and country lands on diesel and other fossil fuels. As well as Inspira Farm. So this was a small transaction that we started off where they're using solar for agri-processing, and we're growing this to be a larger facility so as to reach more people in this space. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to me, and I'd like to hand over to Leah. for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sammy. And thank you very much to all the speakers for the presentation. I have received quite a lot of interesting questions from the audience. So thanks a lot also to the participants for asking interesting questions. So I have a first question addressed to Sara. So the question is, are the TNAs prepared in 2012 still relevant today? So, for example, for the 60 countries that participated before 2018, many prioritized coal, and there were no mentions of sustainable cooling technologies. What is being done to update their TNA?
Thank you for this question, Leah. And at least to my knowledge, not any of the countries participating in the global TNA project may have prioritized coal, but that must be maybe in what we would call the first generation TNAs, which was before the 2009. In any case, of course, priority technologies are changing and a lot of innovation is happening. And once technologies are implemented, they are, of course, not the same priority as they have been. And there's a need for updating the TNAs of countries. For that, we see that countries are now starting to use their readiness funds from the Green Climate Fund for updating their TNA work. And for that, I would encourage countries to get in contact with us and we can discuss how to support going further on that front. Some countries are also asking the Climate Technology Center and Network, the CTCN, which is the operating arm of the UNFCCC technology mechanism, for further support on updating their TNAs. So there are several avenues on how to update the technology priorities with support. So there are avenues, and I would encourage countries to get in contact with us, and then we can support the process further.
Thank you, Sara. I have another question for you. How many of the countries participating in the TNA have implemented their TAPs partially or fully? You mentioned that Estonian TNA in 2018 was integrated in its NDC. Is this referring to its forthcoming 2020 NDC, or did you mean that the TNA integrates NDC targets?
Thank you for that. Well, one effort we continuously are pursuing together with the UNFCCC Secretariat and also with the Technology Executive Committee is that we are trying to track what is being implemented coming out from the TNAs and the technology action plans. And it is difficult because there's no automatically reporting mechanism for us to monitor what is being implemented. So it's really based on us contacting countries and trying to find out what the status is. So based on that, we do have an overview, what we think is being implemented. And we do see that many TAPs are being integrated into national government plans, into project proposals, and also into their NDCs as of now. And coming then to that question with regards to Eswatini, this was information provided from Eswatini team once they prepared their technology needs assessment. So there was a big overlap between the teams working on the TNA and on their INDC at that time. And we know that the team used the methodology from their TNA to prioritize actions to include in their INDC. And we also know that Eswatini integrated the technologies identified in their TNA in their INDC work, so as to say that these technologies were listed in their INDC as a means to reach targets. And of course, that requires updating now that they are submitting an updated NDC.
Thank you, Sara. I have a question for Sammy. Under which conditions would you consider to use crowdfunding?
So thank you very much. Now, crowdfunding is always a great tool when you're raising low amounts of money. So this is anything below 200,000. And the reason why I state that low amounts of money is the time it takes to raise the money takes, depending on the platform, some take quite a long time, while others not so long. However, the cost in crowdfunding is very high. The cost of the debt is very high. So it's a great tool. It's a fast tool, number one, fast for turnaround, fast for low amounts. However, the downside is the high cost of the money.
Great, thanks very much. I have a question for Peter. Peter, how do you balance the need for greater ambition versus the restrictions in finance from local financial institutions, government budgets, and private consumption? So the person that asked this question added that, for example, hybrid vehicles are a transition solution, but it does not deliver the same emissions reduction than electric vehicles powered with renewable energies, for example.
Thanks, Leah. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to really address this. I mean, in terms of how we do this at PFAN, is that we try to be or are technology neutral. So what we are looking at is a situation where we look at the technology to understand that it's going to be sustainable and viable, profitable in a particular application. But it's obviously going to do no harm in terms of the environment and climate. And whether it's going to be commercially viable in that particular application for the period that it's perceived to be or projected to be operating. I think the question is actually going beyond that into a more political sort of arena, and you know, that's not an area that I or really PFAN have much input or experience into. But that's how we approach it. We look at it a project by project basis and understand the viability from the technology point of view, the commercial point of view, and making sure that from all points of climate environment that we're certainly doing no harm and hopefully contributing to a positive climate balance in terms of mitigation, i.e. reduced CO2, and or reduced vulnerability or increased resilience in terms of adaptation.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I don't know if any other speaker wants to add something on this question. Otherwise, we can move to the next question. A question for Federico. What are the main barriers in attracting international finance?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question and a very big question. I think the main barriers are basically multiple, and it really is case and location specific in many instances. I mean, some of the main barriers have been we have presented already. Some of it, I think Peter was very good at highlighting a lot of the barriers that are important. So it's a lot about the arguments that the project idea or the business case presents on its sustainability, financial sustainability in the long run, its robustness, its return on the investment. So one thing is about this, the structuring of the financial aspects of a project, but I would say that's on the more practical side. If you take a bigger loop and go beyond that, it's also an understanding of the different languages that different stakeholders speak. I mean, on one side we have potentially, or a lot of times, project proponents which come from a climate environment background in it can be a ministry, and on the other side we have the banking sector, and they speak very different languages and don't necessarily always understand each other's priorities and raison d'être. Why are they there? And so maybe I think that's the first challenge or barrier to overcome is to basically learn each other's language, learn each other's priorities, learn each other's scopes and why we're there, and then it's great to have mediators, basically like Peter and Sammy, that can actually speak and understand both languages and try to bridge this language difference. So one, you say, advice is to actually look for these mediators, and the UNEP DTU Partnership, we can also provide some assistance in that as well. But I mean, you have others out there. You have, again, PFAN, you have Sunfunder. You have also other players that do the same, like the GGGI. So yeah, that's a very broad and answer to a very big question. And you can have other kinds of answers depending on what you put the focus on. So when we talk about international finance, it's also important to differentiate between what kind of finance providers we're talking about. Are we talking about concessional finance? Then there are specific barriers. And are we talking about market-based depth? Then there are other barriers. Actually, talking about this, maybe if I can share my screen again, maybe there is a figure I would like to show from the publication, which is also about understanding the different players' perspectives and why they're there and what the focus on. And it's actually this figure up here. And these are the priorities of the different players and potential sources of finance. So basically, when you look at the public sector, what are they interested in? They look for the services that they can provide the population, the feasibility of the investments. When we look at other players and we look at the private sector, then we talk about they have other needs as well and other priorities. They want to hear something about the size of the investments, what are the expected returns of the investment, what are the risks involved. And further on, when we look for more concessional sources of finance, we look for other priorities of potential financiers. The other one mentions are still important, but we look for what are the safeguards in place, so environmental and social safeguards. What about gender? What about sustainability, the mitigation and adaptation aspects? So how much climate mitigation or adaptation are we getting for the funds provided? Look at other co-benefits. And then when we look at beyond that, we have the big climate funds. We also have questions about additionality, paradigm shift, transformational change. So I think understanding all these aspects is actually a big barrier, you could say, for project proponents. And it's important to have this understanding before you try to reach out or identify which financiers would be the appropriate for you. It's also important to mention that, like this figure shows, that the amount of concessionality that you can get kind of becomes bigger, but becomes also more and more difficult. All the details and argumentation that you need to provide for your proposal also becomes more and more complex. So I don't know, I hope I at least partially answered parts of the question, but yes.
Thanks a lot, Federico. Peter, would you like to reply this question as well?
Well, yeah, just I think, all Federico, underline and emphasize everything that he said. And I think one of the questions that you need to address is, in thinking about, the internet, accessing international finance, is why do you want to access the international finance in the first place? Is it because the local finance isn't available in the amounts you need? Is it because you can't get the tenors or the maturities that you need? Or are you trying to reduce the cost of finance or other things? And equally, I mean, what we find is that actually local debt, local currency investment is one of the big sort of constraining factors in many of the projects that we find. And I think probably Sammy's finding, will be able to speak to this as well. Being able to raise local debt in local currency with long-term tenors is sometimes something that companies, particularly B2C companies and the distribution type companies that we see in that distribution area, is tremendously challenging. And there, international debt is not necessarily a solution. So again, as I think Federico was trying to say, the key here is understanding what sort of project or investment or company that you are, and what sort of investment you can access because of one of the things that you're trying to achieve, and two, the returns that you are able to offer. And then you start piecing together the sort of investors that you talk to, whether you go to an institution like Sunfunder, or whether you rather knock on the door of the GCF, or both, because of various factors.
Yeah, I mean, just to agree with you, it's a great challenge raising local funding, and hedging instruments are quite costly. In most countries, they're in the double digits, and this really pushes up the cost of money to the project developer and the borrower. So in terms of just innovative ways, is at times you could only hedge the principal portion of the loan, and this reduces the cost of the hedge quite significantly. Or you could hedge 50% of the facility, so that's to lower your risk, your FX risk as a borrower. So those are approaches that we as lenders encourage and also advise our borrowers on.
Thanks a lot to both of you. I have an additional question for Peter. How can a country access to your advisory services to design the financial plan of a project that requires financing?
Good question. We are not really set up, if I'm completely honest, to deal with countries as our clients, if you like. But having said that, I think there would be ways around that, and we have tried to provide our services, and we have indeed provided our services to government institutions, ministries, and agencies in the past. And I think the best way would be, frankly, if anybody interested would contact me, and we would find a way of, one, understanding whether we can provide a service and added value. And if we can provide that value, then find a way of going through the application process that's necessary. But I hope that's understandable.
Yes, it is. I have a last question before we close this webinar to Vladimir. Could you please elaborate a bit on the activities of the tech in regards of supporting developing countries in closing this technology implementation gap?
Here, tech is working on a technology needs assessment, as this is also covered by implementation, let's say, part of technology framework. And work on TNA as by the TEC is going on multiple layers. You could hear I was presenting on barriers and enablers, so there is all the time a paper highlighted barriers and enablers, where one stream is technology needs assessment. And this paper is also serving to be an input material for bodies such as Jehl and GCF to look at where they may consider to accumulate their money. That's one stream. The second stream is looking at good practices and good examples, and also success stories from TNA, and not only analyze them, but also highlight this good example for further consideration, not only parties, but also stakeholders. We organize also side events at every conference of parties or subsidiary body event on TNAs, putting together stakeholders from various fields, from private sector, from finance, who are available at the session to discuss this financial gap existing and possibilities to close it. Last but not least, several private sector stakeholders are or were before part of observer of the TEC observers group in terms of, for example, business, bingo, business and industry, NGOs, but also private companies were there, who also invite us at their fora to see the TNAs, in particular in countries where they had interest to look closer at a possible investor or financing portfolio. So these are several examples. TNA is a solid agenda, I may say, of the TEC, dealt at each and every meeting. You can find the relevant documents also on a TTCLI webpage if you look at the work of tech. And if you go to tech meetings, then under each meetings, there is the set of document shared with the public, and you may see the specific documents, and also I invite you to read the recommendations of key messages. This is a very good overview. And that was a good question, and I invite even if more people would have or want to get closer there, should just contact me, and I'll be even more concrete with activities of where we try to close financial gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. I actually have one last question before closing. It is for Sammy. What is your experience in supporting domestic solar enterprise in the countries you work?
Well, we've worked with quite a number of solar businesses, but personally, from my experience, I can say that there have been challenges from a standpoint of solar from local distributors. But in Sunfunder, we have come up with different ways that we can ensure to get funding for these companies. So one example is a project that we're working with the World Bank in Kenya called COSAP. This is sponsored by the government of Kenya through the Ministry of Energy and the World Bank. And this project targets, marginalized areas in Kenya and increasing access to solar. The majority of the companies that we're working on under this project are locally owned businesses, Kenyan businesses, and the ticket sizes are quite small. So the main challenge why many of the companies are unable to be funded is due to most players in the market have moved up. They're looking at bigger transaction sizes, bigger ticket sizes. But through this support with the World Bank and the government of Kenya, we've been able to come into this space and cater for smaller businesses that are looking to scale their businesses. And we hope that we will get to a point where we'll grow with them and we'll be able to take them to the next level when they'll be now, moving from 100,000 to 500,000 and to 1 million and upwards. So that is our experience with smaller players and locally owned players.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone, for the detailed answers. I think we now come to the end of this webinar. So I would like to thank the panelists for the interesting presentations and the audience as well for their active participation. And we really hope that the presentations will be beneficial for all of you. Please feel free to contact us. I will just put here the contacts. So please feel free to contact us if you have any question. And you can as well consult the TNA website here to access the recording of this webinar. And the presentations will as well be uploaded on our website. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a good day or evening or morning. Bye-bye.